on.
So thank you for attending this important webinar today. I appreciate everybody's interest in the topic that we're going to talk about. My name is Tom Giroux. I'm the president of Wisconsin's Green Fire. And I just wanted to take a moment to recognize that wherever you are in the state of Wisconsin, you're on lands previously occupied by the indigenous people of Wisconsin. People like the Ho-Chunk, the Menominee, the Potawatomi, the Anishinaabe, and many, many more. These people live close to the land for centuries and have an intimate knowledge of the ecology and natural resources of the land. And they're also great stewards of the land and water resources. We'd be well positioned to consult and listen closely to their advice on these matters and others. Thank you everyone for attending, and I'm looking forward to a lively discussion during the Q&A. Fred Clark, you're up.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Fred Clark. I'm the Executive Director of Wisconsin's Green Fire. We're glad to have you with us today on our webinar, Imbalance of Power. And we are currently navigating our first webinar at Wisconsin's Green Fire in some time, which means we're relearning some of the technology. So I'm going to bungle with this for a moment while we get started. And thanks to our Wisconsin's Green Fire Board President, Tom Giroux, for that land acknowledgement. So we're excited to offer this program today on our most recent Opportunities Now paper from Wisconsin's Green Fire, Imbalance of Power. And we're grateful that so many of you have taken time out of your day to attend this program and learn more about this work. This has been a major effort for many of us within Green Fire for much of the last year to pull together what we really see as a unifying story behind a lot of what has happened around conservation and environmental protection in Wisconsin in the last decade. So before we go farther, this program today will be 90 minutes. We will wrap up no later than noon, and we'll hear from our panelists, which I'll introduce in a moment. And then we'll reserve at least 30 minutes between 11:30 and noon for questions and answers. So we want to invite everyone who's an attendee at the webinar today to raise questions or add questions to the list, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. Just in terms of housekeeping on the webinar, Zoom webinar format, you probably know that if you go up to the upper right corner of your screen, you can adjust your view to see the speakers, the individual speakers, or a gallery that'll show you all of the panelists. When we get into the panel discussion and the questions, our panelists will all be live. If you have any technical issues, you can't hear, there's an audio or visual problem, please drop a note in the chat button, and either Sarah Peterson or I will try to address any technical issues that you have. If you have substantive questions or comments that you'd like to make for our discussion at 11:30, please enter those in the Q&A box. So if you go to that Q&A box, you can enter your questions, put your name by them, and again, we'll try to entertain as many of those questions as we can as we get started. A little bit about Wisconsin's Green Fire. We are a 5-year-old organization dedicated to advancing science-informed analysis and policy solutions that address Wisconsin's greatest conservation challenges. That's actually our new mission statement that we developed this summer after a new 5-year strategic planning effort that we conducted with members of our Science Council, our Board of Directors, and our staff. And we're really excited to be entering our next 5 years as an organization dedicated to science and natural resources. And I encourage you to learn more about Wisconsin's Green Fire on our website, wigreenfire.org. And We'll drop some of those links into the chat box as well. But you can learn more about our work. You can see some of the many other natural resources and environmental conservation issues that we've addressed in the last 5 years on our website, and learn more about Green Fire events and activities. So with us today, we're excited to talk a little bit about this paper and also add some additional perspectives around conservation and environmental policy in Wisconsin. And to do that today, we're being joined by Paul Heinen, who is Wisconsin's Green Fire Legislative Liaison. And prior to joining Green Fire, Paul was the Wisconsin DNR's Legislative Liaison from 1983 to 2014, and also worked for the Nature Conservancy in Wisconsin as their state legislative liaison prior to coming to work for what Paul describes as his best job ever at Wisconsin's Green Fire. We're also joined today by Lisa and Tor Anderson of Nelsonville. Lisa and Tor are 21-year residents of the village of Nelsonville in Portage County. They're the parents of 3 children. Tor is a chemical engineer who has worked in the paper and food sectors. He's also chair of the Groundwater Protection Committee in Nelsonville. Lisa was formerly the Nelsonville village clerk. She's a website designer and artist and dedicates a lot of her time to water quality issues in and around Nelsonville, which they'll describe. Mark Thimke is a member of Wisconsin's Green Fire Science Council, and he co-chairs our Contaminants of Emerging Concern work group at Green Fire. But Mark's a retired attorney who worked extensively on behalf of business and industry clients on environmental issues for 42 years in private practice. Mark served as a member and co-chair of the Wisconsin Brownfield Study Group. He currently serves as a member of the Wisconsin DNR EDGE Advisory Group. He's also been a member of numerous advisory groups dealing with PCBs, wastewater, water quality, air, sediment, and remediation, and the DNR's PFAS External Advisory Group. And Mark will bring a unique perspective from the private sector on the issues of environmental regulations. Finally, with us today is Meleesa Johnson. And Meleesa is a member of Green Fire Science Council. She's also a member of our Contaminants of Emerging Concern group. And during the day, Meleesa is the Director of Solid Waste Management for Marathon County, where she directs business operations and programming at a facility that serves central and north central Wisconsin and is intimately familiar with waste management issues, including PFAS and other contaminants. Meleesa is also on the adjunct faculty at UW-Stevens Point Soils and Wastewater Resources Management Program, where she's developed curriculum. And in addition to all of that, she manages to find time to serve as the council president for the city of Stevens Point, and is also in her 3rd term as supervisor for the Portage County Board. So with that, thanks to all of you for being part of the program today. So many of you noted that yesterday was the 50-year anniversary of the Clean Water Act, which was one of the signature pieces of legislation that has really helped result in significant water quality improvements throughout the country in the last 50 years. And if you haven't seen it, there was a very good story in the Wisconsin Journal-Sentinel about that history and about what it meant in Wisconsin, about how staff members and staff scientists at Wisconsin DNR worked closely with the paper companies and regulated industries along the Wisconsin River to essentially achieve the regulatory standards that have been established through the Clean Water Act, and resulted in significant reductions in pollutants that have made the Wisconsin River a resource that you and I can enjoy and swim in and canoe on and recreate on and fish from, that has brought benefits essentially to both businesses and citizens in Wisconsin. And those kind of victories that brought together conservation and science and the role of the business sector was something that Wisconsin did very well for a long time. And one of the reasons that we put the effort into writing this paper was that we think that we have lost that direction. Essentially, our thesis in our Imbalance of Power paper is that as a result of changes in legislation, changes in the way Wisconsin state agencies are able to administer their responsibilities, and practices that quite honestly are not reflecting our best little d democratic traditions. Wisconsin citizens have fewer opportunities today to benefit from natural resources management and outdoor opportunities. And citizens are more at risk from threats to public health, and especially risks associated with contaminated water. In most of this paper, we focused on the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources and its programs and authorities. However, many of the changes that we're describing are not limited to Wisconsin DNR. If you look at what has happened in Wisconsin Department of Ag Trade, Consumer Protection, and other executive branch agencies, the impacts of legislative changes in the last decade have landed throughout the executive branch of government and affect Wisconsin citizens and their lives in many different ways. So I'm just going to mention a few of those, and then I'm going to turn over the program to Paul Heinen. But one of the things that we examine closely in this paper are changes in state law in 2011 and 2017 especially, that significantly complicated and made more difficult what used to be the routine process of state agencies developing administrative rules. If the whole idea of administrative rules is new for you, you can be forgiven. It's not what most regular folks go to bed thinking about at night, and for the most part, you shouldn't have to. But it's a critical part of how government functions. And in the case of the Wisconsin DNR, there are literally hundreds of administrative rules that codify how that agency goes about its business. What we document in Imbalance of Power is that as a result of legislative changes in the years that we mentioned, 2011 and 2017, the process for actually developing and implementing an administrative rule has become substantially more complicated, difficult, and more likely to fail. So what we compared here in this graphic was the additional components that have been added to legislation that essentially create more opportunities to stop, slow down, or block completely the administrative rules that agencies develop as a part of their mandate, essentially, to implement state law and their constitutional responsibilities. It's an important part of the balance of power at both state and federal governments. And the result of these changes are that the rulemaking process is no longer functional here in Wisconsin for important issues. And the result of that is either inaction on issues like PFAS or like nitrates that are essential to quality of life and addressing environmental concerns, even of the highest priority. And it also means that in many cases, agencies are needing to take actions, either no action at all or taking actions that are not codified in rules, which creates problems of its own. So our panelists will discuss more some of the implications of those changes and what it actually means for those of us who are affected by these programs on a day-to-day basis. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Paul Heinen to talk more about our paper and some of the upshot of what we've described over the last 11 years now, since 2011.
Start video. Good morning, everybody. What I'm going to do in my brief time is kind of highlight things that our speakers will be delving into a little bit more deeply. And in particular, I want to highlight 4 areas. where the legislature and the Natural Resources Board have really upset that balance of power that we had before 2010 that Fred was talking about. I started at the Capitol in 1980, and I can remember very well as a legislative aide working with both parties to get things done. It happened all the time. And the whole point of this paper is things change. And now we have an imbalance of power and things are not operating correctly. I also want to mention the fact that we highlighted a number of issues in the paper, and I'm going to talk about 4 of them, but clearly there are many other issues. I'm sure some people would say, hey, what about CAFOs, the concentrated animal feeding operations, or mining, or groundwater? Yes, there are other issues. I assume that probably people wouldn't want to read a 100-page paper. So we tried to pick the key representative issues that kind of show what's gone wrong, what's become imbalanced, and why over the last 12 years. And they're really pretty representative, I think, of the fact that the state government has stripped power from local units of government, and the fact that many pollutants remain unregulated because of that rule process Fred was talking about, and uncleaned up. And they could have and should have been under the normal process. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. And then I'm going to finish up with some recommendations that hopefully are valuable to people. You know, right now, there are 127 unconfirmed appointments in state government. 127 people in this state that the governor called 4 years ago and asked if they would spend their time. Nobody makes any money on board appointments and efforts, you know, all year long, lots of reading, lots of public meetings, and help him govern in a new way because he won an election. And the people of the state assumed he would be able to appoint people that represented what he thought too. 127 people have not been appointed. They haven't been told why. The Senate, by the way, the state Senate has to approve governor's appointees. They've never been told why they haven't been appointed. They just are in limbo. One of them is Sandy Nass, who was appointed as one of the 4 appointees for the Natural Resources Board, and it would have given Governor Evers his board. So there's 7 members on the board. There would be 4 of his appointees. Instead, one of the members, Doc Preen, has decided to stay on. Legally, as the Supreme Court just ruled, he can. Ethically, and I don't know, why would he do that? Julie Anderson was also on when the new appointees were put on or nominated by the governor. She stepped out. You know, it's the politically courteous thing to do. Well, the fact of the matter is we now have a Natural Resources Board that is controlled by the past governor's appointees, not Tony Evers' appointees. And again, I ask you to put yourself in the position of Marcy West and Bill Smith and Sharon Adams, Tony Evers' appointees to the Natural Resources Board, who assumed when they said yes to Governor Evers, they would be in the majority and able to work with the department, which this current board is not, on rules, PFAS, wolves, and they are not. They, not for any reason other than one member has decided he's not going to step down so that he can keep the past governor's philosophies going, even though the state of Wisconsin's people elected Tony Evers. I will make a recommendation about that at the end. One of the places where the legislature really flipped the script was something called shoreland zoning. You can kind of figure out what that means, but think of yourself in a boat, maybe with a fishing rod in your hand and going along the lakeshore, and trees and bushes and all the stuff that's along the lakeshore. Maybe you see in the back there a window from a cottage, or you move on to the next house and it's a McMansion with nothing on the front of their shore land, no trees, no anything, a lot of lawn, very nice, no weeds on the lawn, lots of chemicals to cover it, and then a big metal seawall. The reason why we have shoreline zoning is so that doesn't happen. There's nothing living in the front of that McMansion house. They have effectively killed the natural environment there. So local zoning folks and the DNR had since 1960 got together and updated practices that will stop nutrients from going into the water, from pollutants to going into the water. And that's what shoreland zoning is. Kind of unbelievably, in about 2011, the legislature decided that a program that for all those years, since 1960 to 2010, where the standards were set as minimums so that local folks, local officials could be more specific and set maximums, they flipped it. What the legislature said is, what the minimums are now is the law. Locally, you have no ability to do anything else. That has really turned on its head a program that wasn't set to do that. And if I could just read 3 sentences here from a local zoning official. As a result of the increased building density and impact of these law changes on shoreline vegetation, we expect that lake clarity and water quality are going to be degraded on many of our most used lakes. Years from now, people will be wondering why and how we let that happen. That was a representative piece of legislation. Ben was talking about rules and how the Natural Resources Board approves rules. And you've probably all heard of polyfluoroalkyl substances. I said it. Those are PFAS. And the interesting thing to me about this whole PFAS debate we're having now was they're hardly the first emerging long-term pollutant that we have. The ex-deputy secretary of DNR and the longtime waterhead at DNR often starts his PFAS explanations with a story that multi-million dollars have been spent in terms of lobbying against it. The word or the things that people say who are opposed to it is it's too expensive. The science is wrong. There's not, oh, hold it, Todd stops. That was mercury in 1980. Then he goes on much better than I'll be able to talk about the exact same words used for aldecarb, banned, CFCs. If you remember, that was the ozone hole that we're all gonna burn up, sulfur dioxide for acid rain. We have a process where the health department of Wisconsin tells DNR, here's the issue with the problem. DNR sets the standard, the Natural Resources Board approves it with conversation, and then the legislature gets a look at it. That's not what's happened now. Now we have had on PFAS, they agreed with one standard. One standard they didn't do at all, groundwater, and the other standard they're raised. I think Meleesa Johnson will tell us a lot more about what that has done. And much like PFAS, DNR updates water pollutant rules all the time. Nitrates and phosphorus are 2 of them. And again, the DNR pulled back a rule because of those laws and rules that Fred Clark was talking about. And we don't have the nitrate standards updated. Lisa and Tor are living with that. And they'll be able to give you a little highlight about that. And sorry, I haven't been exactly a ray of sunshine, but let me drop a couple of recommendations on it for you. Vote. Engage in hearings and go to hearings. You have no idea how big your voice is when you actually come to a hearing. So few people do it. Legislators listen. Or else join a group. There's so many groups. I'd be more than happy for anybody to call. And what's your interest? There are groups that your voice becomes thousands of voices. And then I think one of the key things we have to do is, of course, change the process for appointments so that people get voted on. And you got to balance the rules so that costs and benefits are all looked at the same time. So I hope I gave you a little bit of an overview, and the people who can give you a lot more detail on particularly the nitrogen problem is Tor and Lisa Anderson. So take it away, Tor and Lisa.
Hi there. Thanks for letting us talk with you guys today a little bit about our home and our community and the more critical topic of nitrates in drinking water. we're greatly affected by this. But first, I'll start with a little bit of background. We moved to Nelsonville in 2001 with an 8-year-old and a 1-year-old, and we added to our family again after we moved here. And for about 10 years of living here, we used the well as our source of water on a daily basis. We fed that water to our young children. We drank it ourselves, and only after 10 years, not even after 10 years, we upgraded our well because we wanted to get away from our point well and have better utility. And we didn't even find out until about 2020 that our nitrates were very close to the EPA limit, just a hair below the EPA limit. And for all practical purposes, that's contaminated water. We've learned since then that nitrate levels fluctuate quite a bit up and down throughout the year and from year to year. And so I'm sure that we were drinking water that was over 10 parts per million of nitrates. So I guess the village's story began in about 2018 when one of our residents found out that he had high nitrates in his water, and he was asking the village board what they could do to help him resolve this issue, to stop whatever was contaminating his well. And after getting unsatisfactory response, he went around and he grabbed about 12 samples or so from neighbors and found out that there was a very large percentage of them that were contaminated with nitrates. Fast forward a year or so, the county came in and did a village-wide testing of the nitrates in our drinking water and found that 47% of the wells tested had high nitrates, making the water undrinkable. Of those contaminated wells, 25 wells were tested for source testing, and it was found that all 25 had agricultural tracers in the water, whereas only 8 of the samples had both agricultural and domestic or cosmetic tracers in it. So we knew that all the wells were being affected by agriculture, and some of those high nitrate wells were also on the edge of town where they're on the upgradient side of town, so they couldn't be affected by anybody else's septic. So we knew that it was entirely from agriculture in those areas. So we've been on a journey since then, trying to get help, trying to change land uses, trying to make people take this seriously and see what can be done to improve our drinking water here. We've worked with the county, and we've been frustrated by the Land and Water Conservation Committee, whose mandate it is to take care of these resources. They are legally mandated to address this issue, and they have shown their true colors over and over again, that they are really an agriculture protection committee, not looking for opportunities to address this issue at all, but looking for opportunities and ways to cover it up and kick the can down the road at every single turn. More recently in our journey, through working with the DNR, they have required the local CAFO to have field side monitoring wells. And that's even in doubt now too, as they are contesting that in court and hoping, I believe, for a new administration to change that ruling in the DNR. So that's kind of our background. I'm going to turn it over to Lisa, and she'll talk some more about things that are dear to her.
Hi, everybody. We care about this issue because, it affects our health. If it weren't for that, it probably wouldn't matter. But we do have widespread high nitrate in the village, and along with that, we have pesticides. And so I think residents are concerned about, that this unknown cocktail of pesticides and herbicides that we are drinking in our water, spikes that, that we may experience at different times of the year. And, just the high nitrates themselves that have the health consequences that go along with them, of thyroid disease and blue baby syndrome and some cancers. So, anecdotally, it seems like we have an awful lot of cancer and thyroid disease in this village. It's very hard to, nail down that information, but we do have a local retired midwife who has gone on the record and says that during her practice, the Nelsonville area had 4 times the level of miscarriage as other areas in her practice. And so I can tell, the story of one resident here, one family, they did go through a painful experience of a preterm birth. And luckily since then, they have been able to have a baby. They have an 18-month-old baby now. Both the mom, the dad, the baby, and the dog, all 4 have thyroid disease. They all take the same medication. They have 3 cats that passed away prematurely from cancers that are not common in cats. So they also had a reverse osmosis system that they had invested quite a bit in, and came to find out that it was not protecting their water. That their nitrates were still high, and then they had to go to a different system. So I could talk a lot, I guess, about residents here. There is another one who has a wife that has dementia, and he can't control where she takes water from. They have a reverse osmosis system, but she pulls water from wherever she wants to. So that causes him a lot of anxiety. So I guess that the issue for us is mostly when these authorities don't act, such as the county or the DNR. And I don't really personally blame the DNR. I think it's the legislation and the DNR having its hands tied. But when they don't provide the action that we need, it puts the responsibility on us residents, and residents end up, or neighbors, are against neighbors, and it's just not as nice of a place to live anymore. And if this was handled at a higher level, we wouldn't have to deal with this. What it means is, it impacts our quality of life, and we just don't have water security, and we think that everybody should have that right. That drinking water is a basic human right, and people don't understand what it's like to not feel secure about the water that comes out of their tap. I think hopefully that gives people an idea of what we're experiencing here, and we're just looking for help any way we can get it.
Well, thank you, Tora and Lisa. It's a perspective that we really needed to hear. So we appreciate you making time to be part of this program today. And we've got some questions that'll be coming your way later already. So next up will be Mark Thimke, and Mark, I'll get our slideshow teed up again.
All right, thank you, Fred.
Try that.
There we go. All right, thank you, and I'm glad to participate in the discussion today. And certainly all of the perspectives are very important and should be considered as we go through this. For my own work over the last 40 plus years, as Fred mentioned, I've been on numerous advisory, rulemaking, legislative type work. Some of it for clients as a regulatory lawyer, some of it in my personal capacity where I spent time on my own advocating ideas and trying to move either rules or legislation or guidance in directions which I thought were productive and hopefully for people throughout the state. It does give perspective then, not only from what business looks at, but also from working within the system, as you will, and how it has changed over the years. Certainly, Paul and I were active in a number of these efforts over the years, and sometimes we're on different sides. We'd meet up at legislative committees and talk to each other at various times. But we tended to reach compromise and certainly know each other well and want to continue on in this work through Greenfire. I want to take just a couple of minutes here to give you a little bit of a business perspective and some thoughts on, as Fred mentioned, where things have broken down, not only for citizens, but for the business as citizens in the state, and some thoughts on, given where we are, where we might be going. I think one of the overarching aspects in many ways as to why we're here is to understand that we really haven't had new environmental laws that govern a lot of the business activities since the last one being in 1990. And most of the laws were in the late 70s or 80s. That means we're dealing with legal programs that are 40, maybe 50 years old, based on a very different time, a very different situation, and a very different paradigm for how regulatory programs should work. So since we haven't been able to enact any new environmental laws, Congress doesn't seem to do it, the state legislature has trouble doing it. There's been a lot of reliance on rulemaking as the fallback. And so rules are put out to try to adapt to the new situations that come up. And rulemaking over the last 10 years, as Fred noted, has become very, very difficult. So now we've moved to guidance, and guidance has become difficult to deal with. And so now we're working with a fair amount of uncertainty and inability to adapt to new conditions and new situations. From a business standpoint, what we really, business likes is stable regulatory programs and being part of the process. So as a large Fortune 500 company environmental director once told me, he said, "We may not like the program, but if it's stable, I can manage it." Meaning that I know how to deal with it. I know what the rules are. I can manage my budget. I can manage my expectations. I can deal with agencies. I can do training. I can have audits for compliance, and I know what's going on. So stability is one of the parts that is important to business on these kind of programs. At the same time, business changes, business activities change. We've certainly seen that in the state where, the paper industry at one time was dominant in the state and no longer is. There's different types of businesses and different needs. And so programs need to have sufficient flexibility to accommodate one-off situations. The ability to do that now is more difficult, and that creates a problem for the business community as well. The other aspect from a business perspective is participation. Just like Paul and everyone talking here has talked about being part of the process, being engaged, to deal with programs. For example, the water improvement programs that occurred that helped the Wisconsin and Fox Rivers occurred in a participation format. People may not have been entirely favorable with the results on either side, but there was participation and phase-in of any kind of new or substantially changed programs. PFAS is an example where, because the programs didn't promote participation and phase-in, that didn't occur, and we're seeing substantial pushback on the business side because they really weren't feeling engaged and part of the process. Next slide. So what we had for a long time, and what Paul and I dealt with during those years that he's mentioned, things worked well, and I thought they worked well as in developing regulatory programs, was a consensus model. We really in the state were one of these states that had a negotiated regulatory program, which meant that we would have committees of internal and expert external experts. They were committed to a goal, which was to map out a regulatory program. I spent many, many hours and several years developing our current remediation code through that kind of process on my volunteer time. DNR asked me to spend 6 months. I spent 4 years, but we achieved the goal. It was built around communication, discussion of key issues. I won't say that discussions weren't sometimes heated. Sometimes we all expressed our positions, but we found ways to compromise and come out to an understanding on the issues. This takes time to achieve, but it does have long-term lasting results where people buy into the rules and buy into the program. This whole process would occur before formal rulemaking was ever commenced. So the rulemaking process was kind of at the tail end, was a process that we all went through, and maybe there were tweaks, small changes that occurred, but it wasn't a major change to the compromise that was achieved. So even though there were disputes, the compromises stood, and they stood at the Natural Resources Board, and they stood at the legislature, and we were able to move programs forward. Next slide. So we did have the breakdown in this consensus approach. Fred had an excellent slide of all the changes that has occurred. And principally, the legislature imposed substantial process requirements on rulemaking, and time limits were added to rulemaking, such that you couldn't have these pre-negotiated rules, because DNR couldn't talk to you about rulemaking unless there was a scope statement. A scope statement started a time clock. A scope statement had to go through hearings. You couldn't have the kind of back and forth open discussions that were helpful in the prior process. And so DNR started to pull away and not have advisory committees that were productive in reaching consensus. And so that whole process tended to break down. DNR, because of all of these process requirements and timelines, adopted more of what I will call a comment and response approach. So instead of sitting down at a table and negotiating and working through language, working through issues, DNR would put out items for comment. You'd make a response. They'd go back into their process. You wouldn't know what was going on. And then suddenly they would come out with language or changes, but it wasn't in a negotiated type basis. So you would point out where there may be issues, and they may or may not respond to those. So really was a breakdown in that kind of consensus building approach. And so, people tended to go into their respective corners and look for ways to fight each other. And right now, from a business standpoint, they're going, why do we participate in the DNR process anymore? So we'll just use the Natural Resources Board or the legislature as where we want to go, because ultimately they have the authority, they have the power in this process, and they can be used as a block, or we can negotiate what we want at that stage rather than trying to work through the rulemaking process. So that breakdown, which Fred has mentioned and Paul has mentioned, certainly has occurred. Next slide. This breakdown, then, how do we approach it? And I'm saying the breakdown affects both businesses and citizens looking at rulemaking, and those of us who are looking for good programmatic policy to deal with current conditions and not things that have issues out of the 1970s or 1980s on which these laws and many of the rules are based. So traditional rulemaking for these kind of changes, as we've all seen with a number of the rulemakings, it's very difficult. It's resource intensive and very uncertain as a process. Certainly DNR, devoted 30 months, and I devoted time to changing some of the remediation codes around them, update them, deal with current issues. And a part of those rules included PFAS those rules all fell apart, even though there were changes within those rules which made sense for both the environment and for business to promote, say, brownfield redevelopment to occur in a faster and a better format. And those rules were lost, and those changes did not occur. So it's not been just simply a block. It's been a block on many policy items which were good for the state. So where do we deal with that? Michigan faced a very similar problem earlier than Wisconsin. What has gone on in Michigan is to simply bypass the rule approach altogether, not invest the substantial resources and time in rules that don't go anywhere, and simply go to where the people are who make the decisions, and that's at the legislature. And I've certainly done that in the past, where I wanted innovative programs to move forward. And one of the panels I'm on is the EDGE program, and that's an innovative program to promote brownfield redevelopment with community involvement. And we got that passed at the legislative level and didn't go through rulemaking to do it. So the downside to that is you end up with very detailed laws, which used to be rules, but now they're laws. Legislators don't have time to work on detailed environmental policy and laws or understand it. And is that the best approach? But at least it gets something potentially done. And you see that in Michigan, if you look at their environmental laws, they are extremely detailed and look like rules, but they're put into the legislature because that was the only way to deal with it. The other is to try and get innovative. It's a one-off approach, but we do have what we call green tier in Wisconsin for those entities, be they municipalities or businesses, which want to be progressive on environmental programs. And there are a number of businesses and municipalities that want to do that. And it allows for you to be able to structure and affect your own type of regulatory program under this green tier umbrella. But you need to be progressive, you need to be innovative, and you need to be having community involvement in the green tier program. It tends to avoid significant blocks. It's an underused program. It's not a pure substitute for what we had in the past, but if we have to live within the existing structure we have, it is a tool that right now is underutilized, and we really ought to think about empowering the use of this program more at the Department of Natural Resources, and citizens and municipalities and businesses looking at it as a way to achieve better environmental programs in the state. With that, I'll turn it over to Meleesa, my good friend, who can look at it from her perspective, dealing with landfills and other regulatory programs.
Great, thank you, Mark.
And thanks, Mark. Thanks, Fred. And thanks to everybody on our webinar and those who are interested in this topic of trying to navigate this new, where we are today. Let's just put it that way. I'm going to talk a bit about what it's like to be a regulated entity when there's so much uncertainty. Before I got into the solid waste world, I worked in the nuclear world. I worked at Point Beach Nuclear Plant. And us folks who are, and you can, go back to the first slide, Fred. Folks who are regulated, we like to complain about being regulated, right? It's a burden. We all know that. But I can tell you from my time at the nuclear plant, when I was helping to evaluate our power up rate, basically a new application for the site, there's very clear rules related to the nuclear industry, as one would hope, right? Even though that can be challenging to meet all of those goals, it sets the standards. You know where you're going. It is the map to success. Right now, and I'm going to speak specifically to PFAS, we're navigating in the dark. We are a regulated entity. The solid waste industry is regulated almost as much as the nuclear industry and almost as much as the medical industry. for all the same reasons, right? Because we want to make sure we do the best job possible to protect human health and the environment. But I can tell you about 4 years ago, I had no idea what a PFAS was. I was completely unaware of the challenges it faced. And then a letter came out from the DNR to wastewater treatment facilities, 125 wastewater treatment facilities around the state. And it said, this is an emerging concern, this contaminant called per and polyfluorinated alkyls. You need to do some testing, wastewater treatment facilities. Please do the testing. It was a request. And then if you have indicators of these contaminants, you need to look upstream and ask those upstream contributors to reduce their PFAS load into your facility. This meant, and wastewater treatment facilities for landfills, and I'll show you a slide in a minute, are our best friends. We work hand in hand. So now all of a sudden, PFAS are front and center for us in the solid waste world and the wastewater world. But we didn't know what the map was. We didn't know where we were going, what was going to be regulated, how it was going to be regulated. And so I've got the tongue-in-cheek sort of thing here, Donald Rumsfeld's known unknowns, unknowns, unknowns. And I think it is so apt for the journey that I've been on, not only in trying to run my department, but working on a statewide level, trying to figure out, even on a national level, I've been working on PFAS, trying to figure out our route. What are we supposed to be doing and why, and how do we best achieve any goals? Because we don't know what the goals are right now. Next slide. This is what it's like in my life in the last 4 years. So leachate, the water that's produced out of the liquid that's produced in a landfill, that has to be treated somewhere. That'll probably contain some level of PFAS. What are the sources coming into my facility? Will we be named as a responsible party in any potential litigation that could be down the pike? Are there effective treatments? What do we do with biosolids? So the sludge coming out of paper mills and wastewater treatment facilities. How do we destroy this stuff? What sampling do we have to do? What does the groundwater monitoring look like? What are the standards? And we don't have any of those. And to give you the questions that are out there, at one point, there was a discussion from DNR that they wanted landfill sites to sample around our site, sample soils for PFAS. And we were like, but why? What would this be used? And immediately, and I think Mark had talked about this, because we didn't know the map. Thanks for that, Fred. Yeah, the last one was PFAS cycle. Because it's everywhere. These contaminants of emerging concern called PFAS, they're everywhere. And if we're going to be sampling soil, what would be the goal? How would we be impacted? What would be our liability? What would be the cost? And nobody had those answers, because this issue of PFAS is being caught up in this imbalance of power, whether it's the NRB, whether it's the legislature reviewing and rejecting standards. We, from a practical perspective, my colleagues in the wastewater world across the state are trying to figure this out. As you can see from the PFAS cycle, this is the complication we're dealing with. The sources of this compound, which we think we may be expected to regulate and somehow control or manage, are coming from everywhere. They're showing up in our surface water, they're showing up in some groundwater, they're in our homes, they're in industry, they're in landfills, they're in our wastewaters, they're on farm fields, they're in forests, they're in the blood of polar bears. So what has happened because of these uncertainties is fear and distrust. And that's not good, because as I think Mark had said, everybody feels as though their backs are against the wall, and nobody likes feeling like that. So we get in our corners and we're ready to duke it out, trying to figure out who we're going to blame for the challenges of trying to clean up PFAS, or test for, or sample for, or somehow destroy or treat PFAS. So many questions are out there and we have no answers because the regulatory process is long, arduous, and even when we go through the process, as Mark had said, it can be shut down at the legislative level or the NRB level, and we start all over. And that means families like the Andersons, whether it's PFAS or nitrates in their case, they don't get relief. We don't do the best job possible to protect human health and the environment. Next slide. And here's the challenge. There's more questions because we can't even settle on what the drinking, well, now we have drinking water standards and we do have surface water standards, but how does that apply upstream? We still have these products being produced in a wide variety of ways around the globe and even here in the United States. This ad that you see here it was right on my Facebook page and I snipped it, and that was yesterday. Waterproofing is basically a poly or perfluorinated alkyl substance, which changes the surface tension. And now, because that's still being produced, because we don't have any standards, we don't have any prohibitions, we are left kind of trying to figure out how to muddle through this mess. And I will say, it's not necessarily the DNR's fault. I'm not trying to point fingers here. This is about the process, which is cumbersome, laborious, long, and confusing, and very frequently futile. Next slide. So a lot of what I've told you really strikes at the fact that we feel helpless, but in fact, we are not helpless. This is a section of a much longer presentation I've been giving around the state on PFAS to help engage the public in solving this problem. And it's to eliminate the questions. Let's get rid of the questions. So regulated entities like me, like when I was in the nuclear industry, I knew what the answers were. It was clear. The regulations were there. The expectations were there. It was a clear path to success. We don't know what that is right now, but we need your help in making that process more streamlined. We need your voices, your voice towards those solutions. And I have a couple of options here for you to consider. Next slide. So in Minnesota, they've already, and this is legislated by way of this regulation, is banning additionally added PFAS into food packaging. Ladies and gentlemen, and others, your number one source as an adult for PFAS is the food you eat. A lot of that is due to the fact that much of our food packaging contains added PFAS. The Minnesota bill, to me, is a low-hanging fruit. The food packaging industry is already recognizing that this is an important thing to get done because they see the negative impact to their members who are not changing that. So right now, Burger King and Taco Bell and McDonald's and General Mills are all going, we don't want this contaminant in our food and we want to start phasing this out. If we need to, let's, in a collective voice, say to the legislature, to say to the DNR, we want to move towards this. At a minimum, this is one step to creating some clear path to success. The other one is essential use concept. Ask your legislator, ask the DNR, can we start moving towards evaluating whether our makeup really should have PFAS in it? Maybe some firefighting foams do need it. Some semiconductors do need it. But do we really need it in our makeup? Do we really need it in our food? Do we really need it on our carpets? These are things, these are low-hanging fruit to start the discussion, to add in more voices, to push the dialogue towards solutions, setting the standards so we in the regulated industry actually know where we're headed. Next. And the other thing is to be informed, do your research, be engaged. By the time your PFAS-laden garbage comes to me, it's too late. I can't control it. We become a source of PFAS, a sink of PFAS. The leachate that we collect at our landfills need to go to wastewater treatment facilities. The treatment facilities kind of don't know what they're supposed to be setting their standards at as. We do know there's surface water standards, but how does that translate upstream? We need all of you in this process to help us find the path to success so we know what the map is. And these are just a couple of options that you can use as to become more engaged, more informed, and more a part of the process. We all need to work on whether it's nitrates in the case of the Andersons, PFAS overall, or any other contaminant that's going to be harming our environment and your health. We need this process to be clear, concise, so that we in the regulated industry know how to do the right thing. Thanks for your time and thanks for your interest in this really important topic.
Thank you, Meleesa, and I apologize for truncating that show a little bit early. I'm still a novice at PowerPoint and Zoom. But thank you. We covered a lot of ground. So Tor and Lisa, Mark, Meleesa, Paul, thank you for doing our best to wrap our arms around what we know is a complex issue. But if you're someone who cares about conservation in Wisconsin, and I think all 91 people on this call right now do, there's no more important issue to understand and to find solutions for. So we are just about on time, and we want to start our question and answer section. So Mark and Meleesa want to jump back in. And thanks to those of you who have submitted questions. We've got quite a few going already. I'll just start off with one. So the first one that came in, and that question is, what communities in Wisconsin are most at risk from the inability of the Natural Resources Board to legislate properly? I'll just put a little clarification on that question. As a technical matter, the Natural Resources Board does not legislate, but they do have the final authority on the Department of Natural Resources role in developing and approving administrative rules, and also other work of the department, such as master plans for state properties and a variety of other business that large agency undertakes. But when administrative rules are modified or not approved by the Natural Resources Board, that can be a significant impact, which all of the panelists today have described, that can put an end to 30 months or more of hard effort by not only agency staff, but the many different stakeholders and businesses and citizens who have committed to try to inform that process. And that's the part of this system that has really become dysfunctional. Well, Mark and Meleesa, do you have any other insights on where you think the NRB's actions or inactions may be having the greatest impact in Wisconsin?
I'll let Mark go with that one. I think he's probably got a couple of ideas because I can see him smiling.
Well, I think it's become a political reality that there are only certain that environmental issues that are coming up before the NRB, it's a potential block in the process. And unfortunately, the way we have it structured now, you have this 30-month window to develop rules. And if you go to the NRB and you don't get it done, you don't just start where you were, you have to start the whole process over. So essentially, you're penalized and you just can't go back with a few amendments and try and see if you can change it. You've got to go back to the beginning, start over, go back to goal and don't collect $200 and start over on your process. Yeah. So it's a major hurdle. And that is unfortunate because it tends to make things all a yes or no question as opposed to a consensus building compromise type process. And that's where I see things falling apart on these structured timelines that we have.
Yeah.
And I'll add a little to that, I think, and again, I'm gonna, from the PFAS perspective, is that delay just pushes out, anything that has to happen. So in that interim, because of the uncertainty, and this is a real life example for me, which I know Mark is aware of, Marathon County Solid Waste had been taking their leachate for treatment to a local industrial location. And because of the uncertainty of who's responsible for this contamination, what will the standards be, we want to step away from that. That forced us to then look, and that location was like 12 miles away. So tanker trucks going down the road, 6,600 gallons at a time. We produce 18 million gallons. It was convenient and it was affordable. Now we have to go 50 miles to transport that leachate, which increases our costs. Obviously, we can't bear that. I'm an enterprise fund. We don't use tax dollars. Our customers then bear that cost of that uncertainty because a wastewater treatment facility that is close can't be used. We now have to pay more to truck it farther. It's the uncertainty that is impacting my customers, most of which are municipalities. So that's kind of that extended connection of the uncertainty, that 30-month timeline. And then it starts all over again because it's that yes or no, black or white thing. So that's a real challenge.
And part of the other part of the, on the front end of the process, DNR now cannot engage in these kind of preliminary compromise discussions
Right.
until they have a scope statement, which automatically then triggers the 30 months and all the process. So there are time windows to try and reach compromise on like PFAS, which affects so many parts of the regulated community and so many intertwined issues. You can't sit down and have that kind of holistic approach because you've got to get to a you've got to do an environmental impact assessment, and you've got to do a financial impact assessment, and you've got to look at what other state laws, and you've only got 30 months to do this, and you got to go through all these hearings and process. It just doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And,
I think it was 2006 or 2007. The hazardous waste rules, the NR 600 rules, were changed, and group I belonged to, have been president of, we were involved. It was a smooth process, but that was kind of pre-2012, 2010. That process was very engaging. There were a lot of there was consensus building before you even got to the rule development.
Yeah.
That was an efficient way to get a very positive outcome.
It took us 4 years to do the remediation code because we were starting from scratch and it was controversial. But we worked through issue after issue after issue and developed a holistic, comprehensive code on how to do remediation and brownfield redevelopment. We couldn't do that now. We'd never achieve it.
I think one observation of someone who served on the Natural Resources Board is that it's disappointing for many people to see members of the Natural Resources Board put more credibility in the opinion of an industry lobbyist than their own department attorneys as to whether or not the department has authority to take certain actions. And if the Natural Resources Board is not sort of serving as the leadership for the agency, I think that's part of the dysfunction that we're calling out.
I agree.
I'll take over the next question, and it's about mining. There's a statement from Eric first, and then a couple of questions, and I'm really happy that our new president, Tom Giroux, knows a lot about mining, and I think Tom can answer. Eric questions, let me just say that as a member of Oneida County Clean Waters Action, this paper is invaluable to us when we visit town and county boards and try to explain the loss of local control pertaining to their water quality. This paper gives us the ability to show how exactly the legislature has taken that away, which has not been given. For that, I want to thank Green Fire for this effort and look forward to your continued efforts. My question is, could you cover how this legislation affects local control when it pertains to acid mine drainage from mining and how Act 134 contributes to the lack of local input. And then, Tom, we got a related question from Kathleen, who says, I'm concerned about the renewed interest in mining in northern Wisconsin. Probably would need a whole nother webinar, but any legislation to help curb pollution, water contamination, et cetera?
All
You
right.
have 1 minute, Tom.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
So for those of you who may not be aware, there's a greenstone belt across northern Wisconsin, runs roughly from Hayward to Florence, where there are sulfide minerals, nickel, cadmium, copper, gold, silver, and it has to do with the geological history of Wisconsin. So there's this greenstone belt. And of course, with recent legislation for requiring domestic production of these minerals for the solar and battery industry, the eyeglass is on this deposit across northern Wisconsin. There is no lithium that I know of, which is the primary component they're looking for battery, and the quantities of copper and zinc and other minerals are probably not as great as they are in other regions, but they're there. So this Act 134 that Eric referred to is one of those detailed legislations that Mark talked about in his presentation. The industry had a hand in writing the legislation. I think that's pretty clear. And so that's where they did their lobbying, and they got everything I think they essentially wanted in the legislation. And so it does allow for local control, but it really restricts that control to things like truck traffic, noise, dust, like that. The environmental requirements for a sulfide mine are required to be managed by the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, following this very prescriptive legislation that was passed in 2017, really restricting the local control. It's very similar to the CAFO legislation, which gives the authority to DATCAP and DNR and really restrictively limits what local county zoning or environmental regulations can regulate. It preempts it, and only the state can regulate that. So it's a perfect example of what Mark is talking about. Like Paul said, I could do a whole webinar on this, but we won't do that today.
Thanks, Tom. Tor and Lisa, we had a question, and we didn't really have time to address this, but the nitrate issue. Can you just speak briefly to what some of the known human health risks of nitrate contamination are?
Yeah, just, I guess, from a layman's perspective, what we understand is from high nitrates, thyroid disease, certain cancers, and neural tube deformities, or I'm not sure what the word is, but defects in infants. And so typically people have known, or the word has gotten out there pretty well, that pregnant women shouldn't be drinking high nitrate water. But our concern is that therefore it gets dismissed if you don't have a pregnant woman in the home, and nobody should be drinking water with high nitrates. And in our situation, we do have the pesticides that are traveling with the nitrates into our wells.
Yeah, thank you. And the NR 151 revision that recently was pulled back by the department, just so everyone's clear, would have set up a similar targeted performance standard in areas of the state that are highly sensitive to nitrate contamination. And that process now has come to a standstill.
I've got a question here that maybe Mark and Meleesa might want to jump in on. Is that me?
Yep, yeah, that's me. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. I thought it was me. I thought, boy, that's weird. My voice.
No.
This is about contaminant regulations, and it comes from Stephen. Are the standards used to approve use of new chemicals adequate to make good decisions about their safety if put into general use? If not, what do we need to do about that? I believe is what he said. Meleesa, you're smiling, so you got to go first now.
Yeah, well, so from my perspective, and in my class that I teach, the introductory waste management and then the advanced waste management class at UWSP, and again, I don't teach anymore, I just guest lecture. One of the things that I talk about is the system used in the European Union nations, the original 25, I believe it is. And it's really a life cycle assessment. We don't do that when we introduce, a myriad of very complex organic compounds, whether it's pesticides or even things used for household chemicals. We have a very low threshold. Yes, there are standards, but with life cycle assessment, you have to demonstrate the reduction in impacts all along the life cycle, from the very origins of the product. So whether it's the extraction of oil in a petroleum distillate product or minerals or whatever, you have to show impacts along that pathway. And that is weighted on the benefit of it coming out onto a market or available to consumers. Again, that's the European nations that have done that in the past. I think it was the early European Commission nations. And this is one of the things that I pose to the students and ask them, should we be doing this? And they say resoundingly yes. But then the reality is that's not going to fly with our structure that we currently have. So anyway, Mark, I don't know if you have anything else for that.
Yeah, just real quickly, this is much more of a federal issue than state issue, but
Right.
it does show the bifurcation that we have in the balkanization of regulatory programs. So PFAS, for example, is regulated under the Toxic Substances Control Act, another 1976 law with limited updates. So that looks at it from one perspective of the chemical. We also regulate it by the Food and Drug Administration, which came out with approvals, for example, food packaging, and said PFAS on food packaging was just fine from a regulatory standpoint. For a very long time through very different administrations, Democratic and Republican. And so we don't do a full comprehensive look at chemicals, as Meleesa was saying. We balkanize it and have different regulatory agencies with blinders on the full process and have different standards.
I will add to that, we're kind of blaming the process and we're blaming industry, but bear in mind that consumers demand the qualities of some of these chemicals. We love our nonstick pans. We love certain qualities provided by certain pesticides that control whatever, potato beetles, because we want a bumper potato crop. So we're all in this system. And because, as Mark said, it's bifurcated and we don't look at it from a full life cycle, it's a little bit challenging.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to pull together a couple of different questions, as I think we've got more questions than we have time, but several people have asked about sort of alternative models. And so while we all wish that we had a functional rule process, we don't have one right now. Some folks have wondered whether the Michigan model you described, Mark, does that have a role here? And a related question is there a role for nonprofit organizations or other sort of stakeholder groups to help drive the kind of consensus that we used to enjoy in the past and that we don't today?
I'll take a couple of stabs at it. The Michigan model is just a fallback. It's not a panacea, because they recognized earlier than we did in Michigan that rulemaking and guidance essentially was not getting anywhere. And so if you were going to make changes, you had to do them where the power lies, and that's right now the legislature, as difficult as it is. Now, I learned that as well. And so in my public policy hat as co-chair of the Brownfield Study Group, not representing clients, just representing policy. I just went to the legislature. I bypassed rulemaking because I got things done. And so that's a model, but you have to have a good position with the legislature and have developed relationships and able to explain your program to get it passed. There's no, one of the frustrations I think that a number in the business community had with the state now, it's become very polarized, even on the business side. And there's no sort of organization or forum where you can have that kind of debate and consensus building we used to have in the past. And that's really lacking. And maybe we can get a nonprofit to do that. But, you know, business is not a monolith. If you look at it, there are many progressive businesses that want to achieve more progressive goals. And the trade organizations that may be out there are not necessarily fully representing their views. They may be members, but maybe not representing their views. And there's not a place to go, if you will, to have that general consensus discussion occur.
And so I think you've made the point that the dysfunction we're seeing today can be equally bad for businesses that are looking for that stability and predictability that they don't have right now.
Yeah, and innovation, because, you know, business can't wait to go through 30-month cycles and long processes, which are very uncertain to achieve something. We're in a different model than 1980, you know, in a world economy, to maintain competitive businesses and to maintain, you know, business community relationships.
You know, and I need to say too, Mark, you highlighted something that I hope gives people some hope, and that is the Brownfield Study Committee. Well, what the heck is that? I don't know, 25 years ago, you guys put together a group of businesses, environmentalists, agency people who talk about brownfields. That's all they do. And you know what? They became friends, and they became people that feel like they're colleagues, and they're on both sides of the aisle. But when it comes to brownfields, they work things out, and they can talk to Democrats or talk to Republicans because everybody kind of came together. It's a classic example of something in government that is currently working.
Unfortunately, in other program areas, you know, we had the luxury of being kind of semi-independent because the legislature formed us and then kind of forgot about us. So as co-chair, if I wanted to say to, you know, somebody at DNR, I didn't necessarily agree, and here's where we wanted to go as a study committee because the members agreed, we could go do it, and we'd go to the legislature and we'd say, hey, you know, you asked us to advise you, so we're coming to advise you. That was a very powerful approach. We just don't have that functioning well in other parts of the state.
Right.
And it took a commitment by those, I'll tell you, it took a commitment by those of us on the committee and we recruited people for this to say, look, you take your individual hat off and you look at it from a policy perspective. You may differ on policy, but you're taking that, you know, I as a lawyer only represent my client's hat off and look at it from policy. That was productive.
Yeah.
And if I could just add something, you know, our focus has been, of course, on DNR, and I want to stand in defense of my friends who work there. So by day, I am a public administrator. I'm technical staff, you know, technical expert for my community. And then by night, I'm a policymaker. And I have learned as a policymaker the absolute importance of relying on your experts, your subject matter experts. And I can't make decisions about skilled nursing until I've worked with subject matter experts, because that's not my subject area. So I think what's missing is this respect and reliance on our subject matter expert, which are the DNR or DATCAP or DOT. This is what they do. We're paying them money. They have offices. And what I see is many in the legislature disregarding that enormous brain trust of people who are incredibly skilled at doing their job. So that's just, the dual perspective of being, a subject matter expert and then also being a policymaker.
Meleesa, that's well said, and it I think occurs to many of us that those are career professionals who have dedicated their work to public service, and they work for us.
Mhm.
And to deride them as unelected bureaucrats is really doing a disservice to the expertise that we can take advantage of.
Yeah.
A question from Lance was, with the approval of the surface water standards for PFAS, what can we expect on the impact of that rule in forcing new cleanups or around the state where contamination occurs, or how do you expect that rule to begin to change the game with PFAS?
Yeah, I'm just going to go from my solid waste perspective, and then Mark can speak more broadly. From solid waste perspective, I think we're upstream, right? Figuratively and literally in this process, because we're sending leachate to a wastewater treatment facility that may have PFAS in it. How that impacts that surface water, I'm a little uncertain of right now, but what it means as an upstream contributor is some sort of technology that's going to cost more money, some sort of treatment or destruction technology. But ultimately, it also farther down the line, as we looked at in the Fox River and the Bay of Green Bay for responsible parties for PCB cleanups, Marathon County, my employer, we will probably be looking at what that means for the cleanup in the Wisconsin River. So go ahead, Mark.
I should step back. I mean, the rule, it's good to have the rule in place because it does set some timelines and some numbers, and that's good. The timelines are quite elongated under the rule, and that's helpful. I think we have to recognize that not all communities are facing PFAS wastewater discharge issues. Right. Industry has actually pulled out of a lot of PFAS. It's not used in the food packaging industry, in a lot of industries anymore. So we're dealing with legacy issues, which means it's either in the pipes and coming through the wastewater, not because it's put in there, but because it sits there and it leaches out over time. That's going to be a harder issue to deal with, whether or not you have regulatory processes or not. It's all a matter of cost, and it's how much is what is the technology that's available, how much does it cost, and how much is the community willing to bear that cost.
So Fred, I'd like to jump in on this one also. Just remind us, we started out the Clean Water Act, and we literally had chunks flowing into our rivers.
Yeah.
And it's helpful to have this standard that Mark talked about. It's the first baby step in getting to resolve the issue, and let's have some hope that we continue. Where it bothers me though is the Natural Resources Board did not set a standard for groundwater, which means people on rural wells like Thor and Lisa, who may or may not be testing their water, don't know if they're being exposed to PFAS. So, and that was, we hit the 30-month deadline and we passed it, which means it starts all over with another 30-month deadline. Meanwhile, people around Marinette and rural customers are drinking this water, and it's disturbing that rule did not make it through.
Well, Tom and Mark, Meleesa, Tor and Lisa and Paul, thank you all for I guess others will be the judge, but I think this has been a really productive program today.
Mhm.
We did cover a lot of ground. I think if we know one thing is that we didn't solve this problem, but hopefully we understand it better. And, you know, as I think everyone on this call knows, we are facing environmental challenges today that were never understood or in many cases even contemplated when the legislation that we're working from was first developed, is a point that Mark made well. And so we're badly in need of new solutions and new consensus, and it's something our organization is committed to continuing to work toward with help from many of you. If you found the program valuable today, we're thrilled. If you would like to learn more about our work, you can do that at our website. And if you would like to support our work, you can also do that at our website. There's a link in the chat box. For us to be able to continue this work primarily requires support from regular folks all across the state of Wisconsin. So with that, I think we are on the minute and we're going to close out the program. But again, thanks to everyone for joining today. Please stay in touch and we appreciate your work.